This is a special production of ABC News.
I should like them to write on my tomb. He has lived for peace, and he has died for principles.
Anwar Sadat, peacemaker of Egypt, killed in a military assassination. Tonight, in a special extended edition of Nightline, we'll focus on what lies ahead for Egypt, for the Middle East, and for the United States. We'll talk with former President Jimmy Carter, with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former CIA Director Richard Helms, with the Israeli Ambassador Ephraim Evron, and with contributing analyst George Will. We'll have a commentary from ABC's David Brinkley and a remembrance of Anwar Sadat from Barbara Walters.
This is an expanded edition of ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Good evening. Perhaps we shouldn't be shocked by this sort of thing anymore, not during a year in which one man came within inches of killing the Pope and another came equally close to killing the President of the United States. Nor perhaps should we even lay claim to being surprised at today's events in Cairo. After all, only a few weeks ago, President Sadat ordered the expulsion of more than 1,000 Soviets from Egypt, among them Moscow's ambassador, because Sadat claimed the Soviets were involved in massive subversion and plots against his government. Indeed, by the most conservative estimates, Sadat ordered the arrest and detention of more than 1,500 of his domestic religious and political opponents during the past few months alone. So it was clear that trouble was brewing in Egypt, and it was painfully obvious that Anwar Sadat had many enemies at home and abroad. Nevertheless, it was a surprise. It did come as a shock, particularly since the day began so well. ABC's Doreen Kays was an eyewitness from beginning to end.
President Sadat had motorcaded to the parade site from the Defense Ministry, which was a couple of miles away. He arrived. He was dressed in a new military uniform none of us had ever seen before. This was a brand new one. He seemed to be in an upbeat mood, and it was going to be a festive parade. There was a lot of U.S. military, a lot of U.S. arms that had never been on display before. He was very proud to be watching this. Things were progressing nicely, and the parade was almost halfway. We were halfway through the parade. There were jets roaring overhead in a very low fly path, a rather frightening one. When suddenly a grenade was thrown, it took seconds to realize that the bullets were for real. A spray of bullets aimed directly at the Egyptian president, the vice president, the defense minister, and their entourage. Utter pandemonium broke out. Got back to the reviewing stand, which was only a matter of minutes. It was just a sight of devastation. President Sadat was nowhere in sight. He had obviously been removed by helicopter immediately and taken to the hospital.
According to the official Middle East news agency, President Sadat was dead on arrival at Mahdi Military Hospital here in Cairo. According to the official medical report, Sadat was unconscious, had no pulse or heartbeat. His eyes were open and he did not respond to light. He had no movement in his body. He had 2 bullet wounds in the chest, 1 in the left temple, 1 in the neck, 2 bullet wounds in the left leg above the knee, and 1 bullet wound in the arm, and blood flowed from his mouth. Doctors failed to revive the president with blood transfusion, shock treatment, and heart surgery. The unofficial list of casualties in the assassination attack include 8 dead and 27 wounded. Among the injured are 3 American military officers and an American military contractor. The mood in Egypt tonight remains one of shock as the country begins 40 days of official mourning. Ted?
Been a great deal of speculation today about who was behind the Sadat assassination plot, and although nothing is known for certain, correspondent David Ensor has a report on some of the suspects.
It's a question that is haunting U.S. intelligence officials. Sadat's killers, they believe, were discontented Egyptians with obvious help from supporters in the military. But those Egyptians may have had foreign help. A prime Egyptian suspect is a man named Saad Eddin al-Shazli, a former Egyptian chief of staff of the military, who in 1978 established an anti-Sadat front based in Syria, a group which is in fact one of the two claiming to have arranged for the murder. The Shazli group has backing from Libya's Colonel Gaddafi, a sworn enemy of Sadat, as well as from Yasser Arafat of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and from Syria's President Assad. Another suspect is a man named Abdel Salam Zayat, a former deputy prime minister arrested among 1,500 others during Sadat's recent crackdown on dissent. Egypt's government newspapers said Zayat was a Soviet agent of the KGB who had recruited a group of Egyptians, codenamed the Swamp, to bring down the Sadat regime at any price. In the coming days, U.S. intelligence will prepare an assessment for President Reagan on what evidence there is of Russian or Libyan or other outside involvement. That assessment could affect future U.S. foreign policy dramatically. But officials stress Sadat's courage earned him many enemies. We may never know for sure who ordered his death. David Ensor, ABC News, Washington.
One of those mentioned by correspondent Ensor, former Egyptian Chief of Staff Saad Eddin el-Shazli, appeared on Libyan television tonight, urging the people of Egypt to overthrow the government left by Sadat. General el-Shazli did not himself claim responsibility for the killing, but an anonymous phone call to news agencies in Beirut said the assassins were members of a group headed by el-Shazli. It is not surprising that the first call for the overthrow of Sadat's political heirs should come from Libya. ABC's Carl Bernstein has a report on the long-standing enmity between Sadat and Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi.
For most of a decade, Anwar Sadat had been preoccupied, some would say obsessed, with the Libyan threat to Egypt, the peace, and himself. He was convinced that Muammar Gaddafi wanted him killed, so convinced, according to American officials, that on several recent trips abroad, Sadat's plane was secretly protected by American AWACS on orders from the White House. 8 weeks ago, he arrived in Washington for his first meeting with Ronald Reagan. The public part of their agenda dealt with peace in the Mideast. The secret agenda, Libya, a series of discussions so sensitive that only a handful of officials know more than a few details. Since 1975, Mr. Sadat had periodically proposed sending a force of Egyptian troops into Libya, and on at least 2 occasions, according to American diplomats, he was restrained by the United States, most forcefully by President Jimmy Carter. Today, former ambassador to Egypt, Herman Alts, told me, "I passed the word from Jimmy Carter to Sadat that we could not support an invasion. The rationale was that it might not succeed, that the Carter administration could have good relations even with Libya, and that Congress would never approve in the era of post-Watergate reform." Alts was ambassador from 1973 to 1979. Many times, he said, Sadat talked about Gaddafi trying to kill him, described one or another Libyan assassination team picked up in Egypt. Indeed, Gaddafi publicly proclaimed that Sadat would be struck down, and today he was exultant. Last month, Sadat had canceled a visit to Austria after an assassination plot and stockpiled arms were discovered by authorities there. Ronald Reagan, according to his key aides, told Anwar Sadat that the United States and Egypt must isolate the Gaddafi regime and ultimately watch it fall. The two men were to discuss the matter again. And last week, Hosni Mubarak, Mr. Sadat's successor, undertook a mission to Washington to urge President Reagan to hasten that process, supply more arms to resist Libyan moves against Chad and the Sudan, and more important, resist any Libyan provocation of Egypt itself. Tonight, American and Egyptian intelligence authorities stress they have no hard evidence of who was responsible for Sadat's death. His enemies were many: the PLO, radical Muslims, the Soviets, the Iranians, domestic opponents. But Anwar Sadat, according to those who knew him best, was convinced that if he died violently, there would be little doubt about the forces behind his death. They were in Tripoli, he said, in Muammar Gaddafi's revolutionary Libya. Carl Bernstein, ABC News, New York.
Perhaps the most definable starting point for what we now call the Middle East peace process was in the shuttle diplomacy missions of Henry Kissinger during the Nixon administration. Former Secretary of State Kissinger is standing by live now in our New York studios, and in our Washington studios, former CIA Director Richard Helms. Secretary Kissinger, what Carl Bernstein referred to as President Sadat's obsession with Libya, with Muammar Gaddafi, justified, do you think?
I think it is justified. I wouldn't ascribe it to any particular plot. I would say that there has been a movement towards radicalism, a increasing reliance on violence, unopposed by the moderate forces, which created a climate in which a particular order didn't necessarily have to be given. But if one wants to pick a symbol of who represented this, one would certainly pick Gaddafi.
Mr. Helms, we also heard during one of these earlier reports that the intelligence community now is going through a long process of analysis so that they can presumably report to the president on what happened, why it happened, who was behind it. Can you give us some insight to how that process takes place?
Yes, certainly. The first thing that happens after a crisis of this dimension is that the intelligence community goes on a kind of alert. In other words, it becomes sensitized to anything else that might be happening in the world. For example, if there was a conspiracy involved here, the assassination attempt today and the killing of President Sadat might very well be a feint, a cover for some other military operation that might take place elsewhere while the world's attention is distracted. The thing that comes most readily to mind is that Libyans and the people in Chad might very well have decided to attack the Sudan, since they know very well that the Egyptians are very concerned about the status of Sudan and its relationship with Gaddafi. All of these things, therefore, immediately come to mind as possibilities, and every aspect of the intelligence community is working on trying to find out any tie that there might be to these events of today. Now, that will occur particularly in Cairo itself, where a genuine effort will be made to find out who was behind these men in military uniforms that did the shooting. I would say for the future of the Middle East peace process that it was to be hoped that these men acted alone, because if they were a part of a conspiracy, it will make things very difficult in the days ahead.
Dr. Kissinger, what's your assessment? Do you think they did act alone? Is there any way that one can deduce from what has happened today and the manner in which it occurred?
Well, it seems extraordinarily unlikely to me that a military unit of 7 men gets into a parade of elite troops without some high-level collusion, at least within the Egyptian military. But I don't really think that one should concentrate on whether a specific plot was hatched in Tripoli which culminated in the assassination. I think one has to address the general climate in which a little country of 2 million like Tripoli engages in terrorist activities from Northern Ireland to the Philippines, from Morocco to Saudi Arabia, and in which its votaries can always count on training and material support. And so to me it's really a secondary question whether this particular plot was in every detail developed in Tripoli. It reflects a climate of growing radicalism in the Middle East, which for too long has been effectively unopposed, and which has put the people who stood for peace and moderation and for friendship with the West into increasing jeopardy. That seems to me to be the real issue.
But now, is it not true that Anwar Sadat on many occasions wanted, in fact, to invade Libya, and that the United States apparently was a restraining force? Why then?
Well, the United States was not always a restraining force, and I think you showed a segment in which the restraining force was identified earlier in your program.
Well, then let's talk about the administration that preceded that. During your term of office, for example, did President Sadat ever suggest that he wanted to invade Libya, and what message did the United States give him at that time?
Well, during my period in office, we had first to complete various disengagement processes and to settle the remnants of the Arab-Israeli war. But I do not believe that President Sadat felt felt any major objection from the United States if he felt that Egyptian security required that he retaliated against Libyan pressures.
Mr. Helms, what do you think the feelings of moderate Arab nations are on a day like today? I mean, do you think that they feel more or less confident of an association with the United States, that is something to be desired or not to be desired?
I don't know how one answers that question directly with a yes or no answer, but I would think that looking to the future, this might be an opportunity for the moderate Arab states to move toward Egypt and help to end the isolation in which Egypt has found herself since Camp David. At times of grief in the Muslim world, there is a tendency for people of like minds to rally together, and there is the possibility, I think, that this opportunity might be seized to be turned to somewhat more constructive purposes, so that the moderate Arab states could indicate to the new Egyptian government that they had support and were not simply pariahs in the Arab world.
Final question, Dr. Kissinger, do you think that's likely? Do you think that the Arab states, the more moderate states, will now move toward Egypt at a time when Egypt looks weaker than ever?
I think it is necessary to define what we mean by moderation, what the prospects of moderation are, what American policy will be, what the penalties will be for moderation, what confidence they will have in being able to carry through these policies without penalty. Sadat took off our shoulders the burdens of many difficult decisions, and now we have to assume those. So it's very hard to answer this in the abstract. It won't happen quickly, and it won't happen without a clear-cut policy that defines the nature of moderation and the limits that we will put to radicalism.
All right, Dr. Kissinger, Mr. Helms, thank you both very much indeed. In a moment, an interview with former President Carter on the death of Anwar Sadat. It was Jimmy Carter, of course, who brought the Middle East peace process to its high point with the signing of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. Earlier tonight, we talked with former President Carter in our Atlanta bureau about the assassination of Anwar Sadat. President Carter, you must know that a great many people, not only in this country but around the world, are scared silly by what's happened today because they somehow feel in their guts, I think, that we are in a very dangerous period. What do you tell people?
Well, the period is dangerous, and I believe that the events of the day have certainly not helped it. But I know Sadat. I know the Egyptian people fairly well personally and through him. I also know Hosni Mubarak, who will be the next president of Egypt. I realize, Ted, very deeply that the Egyptian people and the Israelis both realize themselves the importance of the peace process. And the last point I'd like to make is that the weak Arab nations, Jordan, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and others, want stability and peace. They don't want to have an upheaval which might even cause the toppling of their own regime. So one reassuring factor is how important the peace process is and how important it is to control any further spread of terrorism and violence and disorder.
And yet, Mr. President, some of the very nations that you mentioned were worried about jumping on board that peace bandwagon at a time when Anwar Sadat was alive and was very much in control. How much more worried must they be now?
They're much more worried. A lot of those leaders that talk publicly in condemnation of Anwar Sadat privately would tell me how much they admired him and how much they hoped the Camp David peace process would work. So there's a difference between public playing to the radical group and their private thoughts, which I think are representative of the overwhelming majority of the people. I was in Egypt when we thought the Camp David peace process had come to an end, when the treaty itself was looked on as hopeless, and there were hundreds of thousands of Egyptians on the fences and on the streets and on housetops cheering Sadat and me with an obvious expression of hope that they would finally have peace. So I think there's a yearning, not only in this country, but in that Mideast region for peace.
President Carter, you know perhaps better than anyone how nervous, how concerned, how worried the Israelis in particular are at the best of times.
Yes.
Do you have any concern that, that given the situation now, the Israelis may have second thoughts about returning all of the Sinai?
It would be a horrible tragedy if they violated their national word of honor as expressed by Prime Minister Begin and as approved by the Knesset, and overwhelmingly by the Israeli people, and went back on their commitment to Egypt, I think that would precipitate an instant crisis, which would be a very serious blow to Israel and to world peace.
But you know what they are worried about. You know their concern is that once the Egyptians get back all of their territory, that then the incentive to continue the peace process is far less. How do you assuage that kind of concern?
We went through this for 13 days at Camp David and many months before and after that. The fact is that with the Sinai in effect demilitarized, as approved by Sadat with the full participation of Hosni Mubarak, Israel faces no real threat from Egypt. And as long as there is peace between Israel and Egypt, there is no foreseeable time when the other Arab countries can successfully launch any attack against Israel. So it's to Egypt's advantage, it's to Israel's advantage to keep that peace between those two most powerful nations in that region of the world. There's no doubt that Egypt is the most powerful Arab nation, and militarily and otherwise we know that Israel, with our support, is also a very powerful factor.
Mr. President, by definition, at a time like this, there's a great deal of speculation, but do you believe in your heart of hearts that either the Libyans or the Russians or some other foreign power were behind this?
I would guess the Libyans were certainly encouraging it, along with a few of the radical religious fanatics who may have been influenced from Iran and other places. But there's no doubt that Gaddafi in Libya has mounted a constant drumfire of opposition to Sadat, attacking Sadat in every possible way. He's an unscrupulous animal who has no morals of his own and who believes in murder as a natural course of his own.
President Sadat was terribly concerned about Libya, wasn't he?
Yes, he always looked on Gaddafi as an insane person, and was always very concerned about what Gaddafi would do and the damage that Gaddafi was doing to Chad and to other countries around Libya.
Did he ever want, I mean, after all, Egypt is a country of 44 million, Libya is a country of slightly more than 2 million. Did President Sadat ever want to take military action against the Libyans?
Yes. He had that in the back of his mind, I think, but Sadat was a man of peace, and I think he felt that eventually Gaddafi would fall because of the inner corruption that he exhibited with his life.
You said yes without any hesitation. Did he discuss it with you?
Well, I don't have any doubt that my answer is correct. Sadat did consider on many occasions the possibility of war against Libya. He looked on Libya as a potential threat, looked on Gaddafi as a madman, and as someone who should be removed from power. But of course, the fact is that Egypt did not invade Libya, and our country, of course, wanted to prevent any sort of conflict of that kind.
Mr. President, you belong to a very small, very exclusive club, and I guess ex-presidents and current presidents have to stick together when push comes to shove. What advice that you can share with us publicly, what advice would you give to President Reagan at a time like this?
I think Sadat's assassination, Ted, is vivid proof of the need for our own country to be much more aggressive in seeking a permanent peace. I was reviewing my notes the other day of the three brief talks that Sadat, Begin, and I made at the time the peace treaty was signed. All of us emphasized the point that peace is not going to come through dormancy or through a quiescent or timid leadership. It can only come if it's waged aggressively. You have to search for and fight for peace in the strongest diplomatic way and exhibit courage. I've been disheartened since I went out of office at the dormant attitude that our own government has taken toward the peace process. The fact is that both Israel and Egypt and some of their leaders have taken public positions for domestic political consumption, which makes it very difficult for them to initiate changes compared to what they have said in the past. They look on us to put forward ideas, and then they can say, well, that's a good idea now, but it's not what I wanted. We'll accede to United States influence. So I found throughout my own experience with Begin, Sadat, that they wanted the United States to play a strong role. So far, we have not done so. And I hope that now in the future, that with Mubarak and Begin eager to see the peace process continued, that our country will provide that stimulus which we did provide several years ago.
Is that a role that the United States should be taking right now, or should Mr. Mubarak have an opportunity to consolidate power?
I think for the next few weeks he ought to consolidate power. He won't be actually elected president until about 60 days go by. But there's no doubt that he was Sadat's choice. When Sadat was in Plains to see me a few weeks ago, the last thing we talked about was his desire, as he expressed to me, to retire from the presidency and to turn over the reins of authority and responsibility for the daily affairs of Egypt to his choice, Hosni Mubarak. I've spent a lot of time with Mubarak. He's been to see me, I would say, a dozen or 15 times. I've talked to him at length alone. I've talked to him in Sadat's presence. And I've talked to him when he was speaking on his own initiative, and also when he was bearing just messages from Sadat that he read to me or delivered to me. I found him to be a very strong man. He's the one that Sadat handpicked. He's a war hero. He's very courageous. He's popular in Egypt, especially popular with the military where the real power lies. And I don't have any feeling at all, no fear, that Mubarak will be a timid, backward leader. I think he'll be bold. I don't think anyone could equal Sadat. I think I'm prejudiced about that, perhaps, but I have confidence in Mubarak.
All right, on that optimistic note, Mr. President, thank you very much. It's been a long and a very difficult day for you, and I appreciate very much you talking to us.
Thank you, Ted.
In a moment, we'll discuss the Sadat assassination and what it means for the future of the Middle East politics with Israel's ambassador to the United States, with the Arab League ambassador to the United Nations, and with the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Aside from Egypt itself, there is perhaps nowhere in the world where the assassination of Anwar Sadat came as more of a shock, nor more ominous for the future than in the state of Israel. Here's a report from correspondent Steve Shepard.
8 years ago today, the Israelis and the Egyptians were locked in bitter combat in the Sinai Desert. To Israeli Knesset member Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat was a dangerous enemy. Tonight, Prime Minister Begin expressed sincere personal sorrow upon learning of the death of the Egyptian president.
The people of Israel share in the mourning of the people of Egypt. We hope that the peace process, despite the cruel act of its enemies, will continue. As we know, President Sadat would wish with all his heart.
But while Begin and others want the peace process to move forward, they are clearly worried. Israel is scheduled to close down 2 important air bases and finish its withdrawal from the Sinai Desert by this coming April. But if there are any signs that the new Egyptian government is moving away from the policies established by Sadat, that withdrawal will have to be reconsidered.
We have until April when we have to leave the remaining part of the Sinai, for our settlers out of their houses and the farmers off their fields. And if there is some indication that the new man that takes over in Egypt is hesitant about continuing the peace process, is simply waiting for April in order to interrupt the process then, it's going to pose a big dilemma for Israelis.
The question is whether the new president, and in a couple of months' time, will be strong enough to carry out the normalization, to keep his ambassadors here in spite of opposition in his own country. If not, then Israel will have to think, to give another thought about the withdrawal.
The Israelis have long feared that the peace agreement with Egypt might be dependent on the life of one man. That man is now dead, and Israel will be very cautious in dealing with his successors. Steve Shepard, ABC News, Tel Aviv.
Standing by live now in our Washington studios is the Israeli ambassador to Washington, Ephraim Evron. At United Nations headquarters in New York, Clovis Maqsood, the Arab League's ambassador to the United Nations. And in our Washington studios, Harold Saunders, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the Carter administration. Ambassador Evron, let's begin with what sounds like rather ominous voices coming from Israel right now. Is it possible that the agreement will not be carried out, that the withdrawal from the Sinai would not be carried out?
If the agreement will be carried out or not does not depend on us. We assume, of course, that the Egyptian government, the new Egyptian president, will follow in the policies of President Sadat. In fact, he stated so today. And we shall wait and see how things develop. I would like to hope that the peace process would continue, and we are certainly devoted to that continuation.
Secretary of State Saunders, you were an integral part of the Camp David process. Was there any contingency to the withdrawal? I mean, if, for example, President Mubarak, should he become president, decided to withdraw somewhat from this process, would that be sufficient reason for the Israelis not to withdraw from the Sinai?
Well, nothing of that kind was written into the peace treaty, but I would start with the statement that Vice President Mubarak made today, that Egypt is committed to the continuation of that process, and I think we have to assume that it will go forward.
Well, the question is whether he has the power to carry that forward, whether he has indeed the kind of following that is necessary to carry that forward. It was difficult enough for Sadat.
I think the peace process in Egypt has very broad support.
Therefore,
I think there'd be popular support for Vice President Mubarak or the new president of Egypt to carry through on that process. I don't think, if there is disagreement with the policies of Egypt in the past, that it has to do with the peace agreement with Israel. It has to do more with other issues, such as the follow-through negotiations on peace between Israel and the Palestinians and its other neighbors, or Egypt's alienation from the Arab world. I think they're the issues that perhaps cause some Egyptians to be concerned about the future, but I don't sense that the peace that has been achieved is a major issue in Egypt.
Ambassador Maqsood, is it possible for a President Mubarak to continue the peace process with Israel and at the same time to mend fences with the rest of his Arab neighbors?
Well, it looks to us that the word peace process has become a misnomer. I think it's an escapist term in order to cover up on continuity, because the lack of alternatives. It is very obvious that one of the compounding factors for the eroding popularity of President Sadat was the fact that when Mr. Begin met with Sadat last summer, and 3 days later the wanton attack on the Baghdad research facilities took place, at that moment it was obvious that the peace process was just a political fiction, and especially this was further proven when the whole Camp David agreements led, instead of an incentive for peaceful approach by Israel, to the proliferation of illegal settlements in the occupied territories, to the annexation of East Jerusalem in a defiance of the international community, and to the expanding aggression on Lebanon, culminating in the attack on Beirut with 300 and more civilians killed.
So I'm not sure, Mr. Ambassador, and I was waiting for you to get around to it, but I'm not sure that I'm really getting an answer to my question, and that is whether it's possible for Egypt under a President Mubarak to move closer to her Arab neighbors.
Now, what I was trying to emphasize is that President Mubarak has to move towards the Arab constituency in direct proportion to his conviction that the peace process was a political fiction.
And if that were to happen, Ambassador Evron, what then would be Israel's reaction?
Well, of course, I cannot agree with anything that Ambassador Maqsood has said. What he's been trying to say in his long reply was that he prefers to see the peace process come to an end or not to have developed. President Sadat was a very courageous man. He realized that there's no alternative to peace, and he changed the face of the Middle East by making peace with Israel and recognizing Israel. I believe, as Mr. Saunders has said that he enjoyed wide support in Egypt in his peace treaty with Israel, and that we should continue. If, however, the new Egyptian government would change course, we shall have all to consider it. But I would hope that the American administration would encourage the Egyptian government to proceed with the peace process, with the Camp David process, would lend support to it, and would make it clear to the others who do not support it that they cannot hope for an American support.
Ambassador Evron, to what degree do you agree with President Carter's observation that the United States should have been more active during the first 8-9 months of the Reagan administration in pushing the peace process?
We have always pushed, if you want to use this word, for the continuation of the autonomy talks. We did not suspend them last year. We asked, even then, President Sadat to resume the negotiations.
No, forgive me. I think his observation was that the United States government
I'm
is
coming
not
to
present.
that.
Yeah.
And earlier this year, when the new administration took office, we appealed to it to resume the negotiations and to influence President Sadat to return to the negotiation table.
So you agree?
We believe that the negotiations for the autonomy should proceed forthwith.
Ambassador Maqsood, what would be, do you think, the most productive path now toward peace in the Middle East?
Well, it is obvious that the autonomy talks are becoming another waste of time, because autonomy is preemptive of independence, preemptive of the right of self-determination for the Palestinian people, which constitutes the central issue in the Middle East. The fact that the term peace process does not mean that it is a process for peace. What has been advocated by the Arabs and by the international community is that the peace should be comprehensive, durable, and just. And in order to do so, the right of the Palestinians for self-determination should be the central and core issue in the overall approach to the Middle Eastern question. The whole problem with the Camp David agreements is that it sought to paralyze Egypt's presence in the Middle East in return to certain euphoric compliments that has been showered on the Camp David agreements, while the whole entire Arab national consensus, from what you might call throughout the ideological spectrum, has refused to adhere to it. And then the credibility of the Camp David agreements, even in the earlier phases of popularity within Egypt, has shown in recent months that that popularity has eroded immensely, and it has been compounded by the contempt with which Israel treated even the advocates of Camp David, whether Americans or Egyptians.
Secretary Saunders, I'd like to go to you for a closing comment. Do you think that Hosni Mubarak can succeed where Anwar Sadat failed?
I don't think it's a question of one man succeeding where another fails. President Sadat certainly did not fail. I can't buy the notion that the peace process is a fiction. A great deal has been achieved, with President Sadat being one of the major contributors since 1973 and 74. What that means, however, is not that the peace process is completed. The peace process still has a lot to be done on it. It was never envisioned during President Sadat's life that the process was either perfect or had been completed. Therefore, the new president of Egypt has a job to finish, as do the Americans and the Israelis. And it seems to me that our commitment ought to be together to finish that process, to vindicate the courage of the men who have brought the process this far. It's not a fiction, it's a reality. It's turned the situation in the Middle East to a point where peace has been possible. It's been something people could visualize, experience, and even feel in the last 7 years. And the job now is to commit ourselves to its completion. And I would share President Carter's notion that we have to pursue that aggressively, and we have to wage peace. We can't just sit here and hope that it will happen.
All right, Secretary Saunders, Ambassador Evron, and Ambassador Maqsood, thank you very much indeed. In a moment, we'll have reports from the White House and the Pentagon on the immediate impact of the Sadat assassination. President Reagan responded to the assassination of President Sadat with a public statement and immediate high-level consultation on what Sadat's death means for U.S. policy in the Middle East. Here's a report from White House correspondent Sam Donaldson.
The news official, the first thing for the president to do was to offer condolences.
America has lost a close friend, the world has lost a great statesman, and mankind has lost a champion of peace.
Condolences offered, the next thing for the president to do was to look ahead. Senior national security officials arrived at the White House for a late afternoon meeting in the cabinet room to consider three things. Was there an immediate threat to Middle East peace that had to be met? What should U.S. policy be toward the interim Egyptian government? How could Washington help settle the new instability today's act injected into the Middle East? On peace, the initial assessment was that neither the Soviets nor militant Arab nations such as Libya would attempt military action. On the new Egyptian government, the initial assessment was upbeat. Only last Friday, President Reagan had met with Egyptian Vice President Mubarak in the Oval Office, the man who today, in announcing Sadat's death, pledged to continue his policies of moderation and of adherence to the Camp David peace process. On instability, one of the first points the president made was, as he told a group of senators, that it is more important now than ever to go through with that controversial proposal to sell AWACS radar planes to Saudi Arabia.
He did indicate that this obviously is a way of strengthening the moderate conservative forces. No one would rejoice more if this sale were turned down than the radical forces in the Middle East.
I've come to the conclusion if there's ever a time to support the President of the United States, right now is that time. And so I'm going to change, and I'm going to support President Reagan on the AWACS decision, and I hope that all my colleagues will consider doing that as well.
Support your president was a theme Ronald Reagan was using today in the wake of the Sadat assassination. But now the AWACS sale has become just one small part of the equation. The Reagan foreign policy team is as yet untested in times of major crisis. If the Middle East should become unraveled, the AWACS controversy will seem like small potatoes. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
There was also a swift U.S. military reaction to the Sadat assassination. Here's a report from Pentagon correspondent John McWethy.
Earlier this evening, elements of America's Rapid Deployment Force were put on a higher state of alert, both the troops and the aircraft that would fly them. Ships operating in the Mediterranean were also boosted to a higher state of readiness. Pentagon sources say it's designed to discourage any nation from trying to exploit the turmoil in Egypt, but it also underscores the grave uncertainty that now surrounds Egypt's future. For the U.S. military, the impact of Sadat's death could be severe. Last year, for the first time, American troops from the Rapid Deployment Force exercised in Egypt, the only Arab country that would have them. Another such maneuver was being planned in the next month or so, but it is now very much up in the air. Ras Banas is an Egyptian air base on which the U.S. plans to spend $100 million a year to build temporary housing for American troops. Permission for that project is based entirely upon handshakes between Sadat and Presidents Carter and Reagan. With Sadat gone, the future of this crucial forward base is uncertain. In the last 3 years, U.S. warships have enjoyed unimpeded passage through the Suez Canal, and American reconnaissance planes have freely flown over Egypt to keep track of the rest of the region. Both of these privileges are now uncertain. Egypt has more than $1 billion of weapons on order from the U.S., but with the exception of some old F-4 fighters and M-60 tanks, very little has been delivered. Sources say this has caused deep bitterness among factions of the Egyptian military who believe that Sadat never should have switched his allegiances to the U.S. from Russia. In an effort to win over some of these disenchanted military leaders in Egypt, and as a highly visible gesture to that country's new president, the United States is looking into ways to accelerate shipment of some of these long-delayed weapon systems. American military leaders want the world to know that although Sadat is gone, the United States continues to value Egypt as a friend that's worth fighting for. John McWethy, ABC News, the Pentagon.
Standing by live now in our studios here in Washington is former White House Press Secretary Jody Powell. Jody, each of the past 4 presidents, and President Carter was no exception, has made a great thing of this close personal relationship with Anwar Sadat. Is it possible that too much was made of that too much reliance was placed on a relationship with one man?
Well, I think you have to be very careful not to jump to conclusions such as that because of that close personal relationship. in none of these administrations, certainly not in the Carter administration, was American policy in the Middle East based entirely upon Anwar Sadat. President Sadat was a towering figure, a man whose very presence tended to dominate the scene, and because he was so courageous and moved so far, so fast, the focus was upon him. But American policy has always sought a comprehensive peace, a peace that recognized the security of Israel and the rights of the Palestinians. And no, I don't think our relationship with President Sadat was too close at all.
Well, I'm referring, for example, to what Jack McWethy referred to with these handshake agreements with both President Carter and President Reagan. That does seem to place a rather heavy burden of responsibility on the relationship with one man.
Well, as you know, it would be not possible to conduct diplomacy, particularly in sensitive areas, if every agreement between heads of state or heads of government had to be in the form of a formal treaty ratified by the Senate here in the United States. It would grind diplomacy to an absolute halt. So these commitments, obviously, when there is a change of leadership, we've just experienced one in this country, there may be some doubt, some uncertainty, but it's a mistake, I think, for us and for others who are interested in the peace process to begin now to send signals that we might be so concerned that our consideration is to pull back either in our role in the process or in the region, as opposed to a determination to move forward more aggressively. We can't control completely what happens in Israel, but certainly the wrong signals from us could be counterproductive in that political process that's going on there now.
Jody, I'm sure you recognize the theme that Sam Donaldson reflected a moment ago, which he reduced to kind of a shorthand, namely the one of support your president. That is one that White Houses in general, or the administrations in general, fall back on occasion. Do you think it's going to work this time with regard to the AWACS package?
That's very difficult to say. Certainly the last thing that we need, forget about Republican, Democrat, whatever, is a divisive debate and rejection of the president's proposal in such a sensitive region. And I would hope that we could have a period of quiet and lowered voices on this matter, and then if things look at the end of that period as they do now, that the Senate would move to support the president, which I consider to be a very worthwhile concept and something we probably ought to do more of, whatever the party identity of the president might be.
Well, now, of course, the Carter administration also favored the idea of sending the AWACS to Saudi Arabia, but how do you respond to the question that is being raised by a lot of people now, namely that some of these governments are so fragile that there has to be an inherent danger in allowing sophisticated American weaponry to rest in their hands?
There is no doubt that that is a very sensitive, chaotic region, and it has been for some time. It seems to me that the fundamental question is that if we recognize that fact, do we then withdraw and pull back, or do we move more aggressively to pursue our interest, which happen to be twofold, I think. One, the blocking of Soviet expansion, and two, and they are inextricably intertwined, a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You will not be able to do the first unless you are able to do the latter.
All right, Jody Powell, thanks very much for joining us. When we come back, we'll have a commentary by David Brinkley and some reflections on today's events from contributing analyst George Will and Middle East specialist Marvin Zonas. Standing by live now in our Chicago bureau is Professor Marvin Zonas of the University of Chicago, a frequent guest on Nightline, who is a student of both Middle East politics and psychology. Also joining us from our affiliate, WCVB in Boston, is our contributing analyst, George Will. George, a little bit of conflict, I suppose, between, on the one hand, those who are saying that Anwar Sadat was unique, a towering figure on the world stage, and those who are saying at the same time, but not to worry, Hosni Mubarak is going to continue the policies, maybe even as successfully. Unravel that, would you?
Well, even if we assume, and I suppose because he was Sadat's chosen successor, we can assume that the vice president's heart is behind Sadat's policies. What you have to ask is this: what are the odds that a society like Egypt and a political system like theirs will churn to the surface two in a row? That is, two people with the inclination and the political skill to resist the tremendous gravitational pull in the region to, in the euphemism, reconcile Egypt with the rejectionist front. So it requires not just an inclination, but a kind of political capacity that's rare in the best and most mature of countries. And Egypt is not the most mature, promising political society.
What are the pluses and minuses there, George? What advantage would there be, for example, to Mubarak if he were to pitch everything now and reassume old relationships with the Arab world?
Well, I don't know. There can be bribery, I suppose. I mean, the simple offer of cash. And in this regard, we have to wonder what our newfound friends, the Saudis, are going to do. Are they going to be a force for moderation at this critical moment with regard to keeping Egypt where the Saudis, we are told, say their heart is, which is with the West and with the moderates, such as they are in the Middle East? Second, the Reagan administration will, I assume, want to expedite ways of demonstrating the critical thing in the Middle East, which the Sadat assassination must call into question. That is it more dangerous to be the friend of the United States or its enemy?
All right, Marvin Zonas, is it? Is it more dangerous? And if you were analyzing now what's going on in the inner councils of what we refer to as moderate Arab nations, what do you think they're saying about alliances or friendships or even a partnership with the United States these days?
I think the issue is a crucial one. I don't think we can put it quite as simply as an association with or an alliance with the United States. It seems to me the key issue is whether or not the leader identifies with the United States. President Sadat, the late Shah of Iran, all had an identification with the United States which made them on the surface seem almost more American than they seemed either Egyptian or an Iranian. That's, it seems to me, where the Saudis have it over those two countries. They're very clear about retaining their Saudi identity while associating their policies with the West, and that's the course that these moderate states have to go.
Yes, but I mean, in their association of policies with the West, they are also placing conditions, for example, on the receipt of these AWACS aircraft that may prove to be unacceptable to the U.S. Congress. Where does that lead us now, given the new climate that exists in the wake of today's events in the Middle East?
Well, I think it's no question but that the Saudis are trying to impose those limitations on the West for fear of too close an association in the minds of their own people and the radical rejectionists. And I think it's a failure of the Reagan administration not to have anticipated the political fallout at home so that they could have prepared for that day long months before this issue came before the Congress. That's, of course, all behind us now, and what we have to do, I think, is trade off on the shock, which I think will flow through the United States Congress as a result of the assassination, to try to move that AWACS forward.
George, you referred slightly disparagingly a moment ago to our newfound friends, the Saudis. They are not, of course, newfound friends, although a new emphasis has certainly been placed on that friendship. To what degree do you think that new emphasis undermined Anwar Sadat?
I don't know, Ted, and I didn't mean to sound disparaging. I do think that the evidence about the genuine convictions and the real heart of the Saudis is mixed. There is no question that they continue to fund some of the extremist elements in the Middle East, this being rationalized as kind of protection money. We're supposed to say that's not their real inclination. This is one of those moments in the Middle East where people have to stand up and be counted, which is something the Saudis do not like to do and have not been pushed to do. Therefore, it seems to me, the eyes have to shift now to the other of the so-called pillars of our strength in the Middle East. We had 3 going into today, now we have 2. We're down to Israel and Saudi Arabia. The fact remains that Israel has to look a little better and a little more important tonight because it's the only regime in the Middle East that cannot be changed by a bullet.
Do you agree, Marvin, that we're down to 2?
No question. It reminds me very much of the so-called twin pillars policy, which we had for many years in the 70s, except then the twin pillars were Saudi Arabia and Iran. We're now down to Saudi Arabia and Israel, and that's going to be more of a tightrope for the United States to walk than was Iran and Saudi Arabia.
It conjures up an interesting image that you have twin pillars of an edifice with the pillars apparently pulling in different directions. What does that say for our alliances in the Middle East these days?
No question. I think that they are pulling in different directions, and we have to ask the Saudis to be counted now that this is the moment of truth, but we can't ask them to be counted publicly. I think it's absolutely crucial that we not expect them to make a public declaration for their fear that assassination of their leaders, overthrow of the royal family, will be forthcoming. There are many other important ways that they can demonstrate where they stand, however. It doesn't have to be public.
All right. Marvin Zonas, George Will, thank you both very much. Some further thoughts now on Anwar Sadat and his unique place in contemporary history from ABC's David Brinkley.
Your average leader of a reasonably democratic country these days will hardly buy a pair of socks, get a haircut, or tell you what time it is without first taking a poll to see if he will have public support. But Anwar Sadat took a chance when no other Arab leader would. And if the same circumstances had then existed elsewhere in the world, it is not clear that any national leader, Arab or otherwise, would have done what he did. He made a deal with Israel and stuck to it at the cost of almost every friend he had in the Arab world, and at the cost of plots, pressures, and threats on his life. In these years since Camp David, it has been remarkable to see how people around most of the world have reacted to a public act of simple, decent